The Soviet Union had a secret it could not keep. And for 72 hours, while the fire burned, while the reactor core lay open to the sky like a wound that couldn't close, that secret traveled on the wind. It crossed the Ukrainian countryside. It drifted over Poland. It settled into the soil of Sweden, Finland, Denmark, countries that had no idea they were receiving something the Soviet government was not yet willing to admit existed. By the time Moscow finally said 2 sentences about it on the evening news, 18 seconds, buried between a story about agricultural quotas and a sports update, the radiation had already circled the globe. The empire kept its secret. The atmosphere did not. Here's the thing most Americans know about Chernobyl. They know what they saw on HBO. The white-knuckle tension of the control room, the faces of the first responders walking towards something they didn't understand, Jared Harris staring into a courtroom with the weight of an impossible confession. That show was extraordinary, but it was drama. It was a story with a beginning, a middle, and an ending that could fit inside 5 hours of television. The real story, the one that happened in real time, in the dark, inside a system that was structurally incapable of telling the truth, that one is messier, longer, and in some ways, far stranger than anything a screenwriter would dare to invent. Because the real Chernobyl isn't just a story about a reactor explosion. It's a story about what happens when a government cannot say, "We were wrong." When the machinery of an entire civilization is built on the premise that the state does not fail, and then the state fails, catastrophically, undeniably, in a way that glows in the dark and shows up on radiation detectors in a country 2,000 miles away. What do you do? What do you say? How do you manage a disaster that the ideology of your entire system says cannot be happening? That's the story we're telling today. And look, this one hits different right now. Because the question at the center of Chernobyl isn't really about nuclear physics. It's about information. About who controls it, who withholds it, and what it costs ordinary people when the answer to a catastrophe is silence. That's not a Soviet question. That's a human one. And 40 years later, on the anniversary of the night that Reactor 4 blew open, denial over disclosure. And what happened next. Before we get into it, if you're new here, consider subscribing. This channel is where history gets told the way it deserves, like it actually happened, not like it was summarized in a textbook. Hit the bell, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious what time it is for you right now. And let's go. It was a Saturday morning in Pripyat. That's the detail that gets me every time. Not night, not some grim winter darkness. A Saturday. Late April, which in northern Ukraine means the first real warmth of the year has finally arrived. The kind of warmth that makes people open their windows and let their kids play outside. The city of Pripyat was young, not just in age, barely 16 years old as a city, but in its population. The average resident was 26 years old. 26. It was a place full of young families, engineers in their 30s, children who had never known anything but the clean streets and reliable grocery stores that came with being a model Soviet city. A showcase city, built specifically to house the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The plant was visible from the apartment balconies. On a clear day, you could see the cooling towers from the city park. People were proud of it, the way Americans in a company town are proud of the factory that built everything they have. Nuclear power was the future. The Soviet Union had staked enormous prestige on it. Chernobyl was proof that socialist science could tame the atom and turn it into electricity for millions of homes. Saturday morning, the kids were outside. Some people were planning weekend trips. A couple had just gotten married the night before. April 26th was their wedding day, and the photographs from their ceremony show the reactor building visible in the background, intact, normal, just another piece of the skyline. At 1:23 in the morning, the reactor had already exploded. But the city didn't know. Here's what the explosion actually was, stripped of technical language. It was a runaway chain reaction during a safety test. A test that had been delayed for months, pushed from shift to shift, finally conducted at night by an exhausted crew under pressure from above to finish it quickly. The reactor design, the RBMK-1000, had a flaw, a serious one, that the operators didn't know about. Under certain conditions, the control rods that were supposed to slow a runaway reaction would actually accelerate it briefly before slowing it. The crew pushed the reactor into a configuration that triggered exactly that flaw. Power surged, steam pressure spiked, and then, in a matter of seconds, 2 explosions tore the roof off Reactor 4, blew the 1,200-ton reactor lid into the air like a coin flip, and opened the burning core directly to the sky. 2 men died immediately in the explosion, but the full consequences, those were invisible, colorless, tasteless. The air that Saturday morning in Pripyat smelled like nothing unusual. It felt like spring. The radiation that was already flooding the streets registered on no sense a human being possesses. You could stand outside in it and feel fine. Some people reported a slight metallic taste. A few noticed their eyes were watering more than usual. But mostly, nothing. Just a Saturday morning. The first responders, the firefighters, got the call within minutes. They knew there had been an explosion. They were told it was a fire on the roof of the reactor building. The full scale of what was burning, the fact that they were walking into an open, destroyed reactor core, was not communicated to them. The men who briefed them knew very little themselves. The material they were about to climb over, hold in their bare hands when they picked up pieces of graphite from the reactor core that had been blown across the roof, that material was delivering a radiation dose that would kill a human being within weeks. One of the firefighters who arrived in those first minutes described it later in a Soviet documentary interview. He got to the site around 1:45 in the morning. He could see the graphite scattered across the roof. Dense, black chunks, still hot. One of the other men picked one up. He said it was warm to the touch. They didn't know what that meant. They were firemen. They had been trained to fight fires. They fought the fire. Within hours, the men on that roof were vomiting. Their skin was turning red. The first signs of radiation burns, appearing without any visible flame, without any source of heat they could point to. Some of them felt almost fine. The cruelest trick of acute radiation syndrome is that the initial symptoms can fade, leaving the victim feeling like maybe it wasn't so bad before the second wave hits, the one that is not survivable. They were flown to Moscow within days to Hospital Number 6, the specialized facility for radiation injuries. The doctors there had almost no experience with cases of this severity. They did what they could. 28 of those first responders died within 3 months. But that Saturday morning, while the firefighters were on the roof, while the reactor burned, while the radioactive plume was already rising into the night sky and beginning its journey on the wind, Pripyat was asleep. The wedding couple slept. The kids slept. 50,000 people in a city built around a reactor that had just destroyed itself. And none of them knew. The authorities knew. The plant director knew within the hour. The regional party bosses were woken up with calls. Word traveled up the chain. And at every level of that chain, the same instinct kicked in. Contain the information. Figure out the story. Do not cause panic. Do not say anything until you know exactly what to say. That instinct wasn't stupidity. It wasn't even necessarily malice.
at least not in those first hours. It was the way the system worked. The Soviet system had been built over decades on the principle that bad news traveled up slowly, was softened at every level, and reached the top in a form that was manageable. Problems were minimized, not because individuals were evil, but because the incentive structure rewarded minimization.
A party official who reported a catastrophe too dramatically risked being seen as alarmist, incompetent, responsible. A party official who reported it calmly, with assurances that the situation was under control, that official had done his job correctly. It didn't matter that the situation wasn't under control, the report had to say it was. So the reports said it was. The government commission that flew to Chernobyl in the early hours of Saturday morning included some of the most senior figures in Soviet science and industry. Boris Shcherbina, a deputy prime minister, led it. He was not a nuclear specialist. He was a manager, a fixer, a man who had spent his career making the impossible happen through force of will and party authority. He arrived at Chernobyl and was told by the plant director that the reactor was intact, that the explosion had been in the building, not the reactor itself, that the radiation readings were elevated but manageable, that there was no need for mass evacuation. Some of that was honest error. The plant director genuinely seemed to believe parts of it. The instruments that would have shown the true radiation levels so high they were simply not supposed to be possible, had been destroyed in the explosion or gone off their scales. When a dosimeter reads maximum and stays there, a man who has never seen anything like that before might assume the dosimeter is broken. The alternative is that the reactor core is lying open to the sky, burning, releasing radiation at levels that will contaminate 200,000 square kilometers of Europe. That alternative is simply too large to hold in your mind in the first hours. So you assume the dosimeter is broken. But even as evidence accumulated, as the firefighters started collapsing, as the dosimeters at greater distances from the plant started giving terrifying readings, as a Soviet helicopter pilot hovered over the reactor and looked down into the open, glowing core, even then, the reports going to Moscow remained optimistic. Situation difficult but manageable. Measures being taken. No cause for alarm. 36 hours after the explosion, the evacuation of Pripyat finally began. 36 hours. A city of 50,000 people, within 2 miles of an open, burning reactor core, and it took a day and a half to begin moving them. When the announcement came over the city loudspeakers, a woman's voice, calm, almost cheerful, it described a temporary relocation. Residents were told to bring documents, essential items, food for 3 days. They were told they would return home soon. Most of them left their photo albums, left their pets, left furniture they'd saved years to buy. They locked their front doors. Nobody ever moved back. The buses, more than 1,000 of them, lined the streets and took the people away. It was April 27th, a Sunday afternoon, warm and green, the kind of afternoon that would ordinarily have the parks full. People walked to the buses with small bags. Some of them were confused, most were calm. The announcement had said 3 days. You can handle 3 days. You tell yourself, 3 days and then home. The children who were standing outside that morning, playing in a city that had been flooded with radiation for 36 hours, some of them had already received doses that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Some of them didn't know it for years. Thyroid cancer in children. A disease so rare in normal populations that a cluster of cases is statistically almost impossible, began appearing in the region within a decade. The thyroid gland absorbs radioactive iodine the way a sponge absorbs water. Children's thyroids are particularly efficient at this. If you had told the people of Pripyat on Friday evening what was coming, if you had started the evacuation at dawn on Saturday, if you had distributed iodine tablets to block the thyroid's absorption, the medical literature is clear that thousands of cancers might have been prevented. But the announcement didn't come Friday evening. It came Sunday afternoon. And the iodine tablets, they existed, they were available, were not distributed to the population. Local officials were afraid that handing out iodine tablets would cause panic. Better to move the people quietly, calmly, without anyone understanding why. There's a detail that surfaces in the declassified KGB reports from those days that demands attention. As the evacuation was underway, as the buses were loading in Pripyat, KGB officers in Kyiv, 150 miles to the south, were monitoring the behavior of foreign nationals in the city. Diplomats, exchange students, journalists. Reports documented Canadian students trying to leave Kyiv, French embassy staff making inquiries, American diplomats calling the city's epidemiological station asking about radiation levels. And the response, as recorded in the KGB files, was to send representatives to speak with these foreigners, to have calm, reassuring conversations. Everything is fine. There is no danger to the city. Please go about your normal activities. In Kyiv, on the morning of May 1st, 5 days after the explosion, the radiation level in some parts of the city was 500 times higher than normal.
KGB internal reports documented readings of 500 to 1200 microrems per hour in the city at 7 in the morning. And in those same hours, more than 100,000 people were marching down the Kremlin, the main boulevard, for the May Day parade. Children in the crowd, balloons, folk dancers. The Communist Party leadership of the Ukrainian Republic standing on the reviewing stand, watching the parade go by. Mikhail Gorbachev personally ordered that the parade go forward. By one account, he threatened the Ukrainian party chief, Vladimir Sherbitsky, with dismissal if the celebrations were cancelled. The parade would show the world that the Soviet Union was not in crisis, that life was normal, that whatever had happened at Chernobyl was a manageable industrial incident, not a civilization-scale catastrophe. The people in that parade, breathing that air, were props in a performance of normalcy that their government needed more than it needed to protect them. The world, meanwhile, was not receiving the same performance. 3 days after the explosion, on Monday morning, April 28th, a worker arrived at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, north of Stockholm, and walked through the radiation detector at the entrance. The alarm sounded. His clothing was contaminated. The plant immediately began checking its own systems for a leak, assuming the source was internal. No leak was found. The contamination was coming from outside. Swedish scientists traced the direction of the wind and made a calculation. By lunchtime, they had identified the Soviet Union as the source. By evening, the Swedish government had formally demanded an explanation from Moscow. Moscow, when contacted through diplomatic channels, initially said nothing. The duty officer at the Soviet Atomic Energy Agency told the Swedish embassy he had no information about any accident. This was, and there is no diplomatic way to phrase this, a lie. Soviet officials had known about the explosion for 60 hours. The deputy prime minister was already at the site. And when the Swedes pushed harder, threatening to file an official complaint with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Soviet response finally shifted. A short statement was approved. It would be read on the evening news program Vremya, the nightly broadcast that was, for most Soviet citizens, the only window into what was happening in the world. The anchor read it in 18 seconds. As was officially communicated by the Council of Ministers of the USSR, an accident has occurred at the Chernobyl atomic power station. One of the atomic reactors has been damaged. Measures are being taken to eliminate the consequences of the accident. Aid is being given to those affected. A governmental commission has been created. That was it. No location, no scale,
No indication that 50,000 people had already been evacuated, that 30 firefighters were dying in Moscow hospitals, that the radiation cloud was already over Scandinavia. 18 seconds, then back to the agricultural report. The next morning, that statement was reprinted in the Soviet newspaper Izvestia. 6 sentences, placed at the bottom of the 3rd page. Next to it, on the same page, was a report on the results of a bicycle race. On the first page of the same edition, a story about a factory in Kyiv that had exceeded its production quota. The Chernobyl story did not make the front page of any major Soviet newspaper for weeks. In West Germany, by contrast, the story led every newscast from the moment the Swedes went public. ARD, the main public broadcaster, devoted the bulk of its evening news to satellite images of the plant, to radiation readings from across Europe, to expert analysis of what the contamination levels meant for food safety, water supplies, children's health. German families were being told to keep their children indoors, to avoid leafy vegetables, to check their produce. The German public knew, in real time, what was happening. Not because Germany had better intelligence, but because its media operated under a different set of assumptions about what the public was entitled to know. The contrast was total. On one side of the Iron Curtain, wall-to-wall coverage, public health advisories, political debate about the future of nuclear power. On the other side, a bicycle race on page 3 and a folk dancing display at the May Day parade. But the thing that gets lost in simpler tellings of this story, Moscow wasn't just lying to the world. It was, in some important sense, lying to itself. The system that produced the 18-second Vremya announcement wasn't a system where cynical leaders knew the truth and chose to conceal it from a deceived public. It was a system where the leaders themselves were receiving filtered information, where the reports coming up from the site had been softened at every relay point, where the instinct to minimize had been baked into every layer of the bureaucracy so thoroughly that even the men making decisions were often working from information that had been quietly, reflexively optimized away from terror and toward manageability. Gorbachev would later say that in the first days, he genuinely didn't have the full picture. Some historians are skeptical of this, but the structure of Soviet information flow makes it at least partially credible. The people at the bottom of the chain knew the worst of it. The people at the top received a version that was designed not to be the worst of it.
Not through any single act of deliberate deception, through the accumulated weight of a system that had spent decades punishing messengers who brought unmanageable news. What Gorbachev did with this situation, how he eventually chose to respond, what it cost him politically, and what it started in motion, that's a story that touches the very roots of how the Soviet Union ended. Because Chernobyl didn't just contaminate a landscape. It contaminated something more fragile and more essential. The story the Soviet state told about itself. And once that contamination started, it was every bit as impossible to contain as the radiation spreading silently from that open reactor, drifting westward on the April wind, settling into soil that would carry it for generations. The men who went in to stop it had no real idea what they were walking into, and some of them, in the days that followed, would be asked to walk in anyway. The lie had a shape. That's the thing people miss when they think about Soviet propaganda. They imagine it as something crude, something that only worked on the naive or the desperate. Posters with heroic workers, newsreaders with stiff hair reading from index cards, the kind of obvious theater that educated people saw through immediately. But the lie that sustained the Soviet state wasn't crude. It was architectural. It was load-bearing. It held up the ceiling. Here's how it actually worked. The Soviet system didn't require its citizens to believe everything the state said. It required them to act as though they did. That's a completely different thing. A factory worker in Kyiv in 1986 might privately suspect that the official agricultural statistics were inflated. His neighbor might quietly know that the stories about capitalist misery in American cities were exaggerated. The system didn't need them to be convinced. It needed them to show up, to participate, to march in the May Day parade and wave the flag, not because they were fooled, but because the act of participation was itself the point. Compliance was the product. Belief was optional. This distinction matters enormously for understanding what happened after Chernobyl. The machinery of denial that kicked in within hours of the explosion wasn't designed to fool people. It was designed to manage them, to route the situation through the established channels of Soviet crisis response in a way that preserved the appearance of control, which was itself a form of control. If the state appeared to be managing the crisis was, in the only sense that mattered politically, managed. The problem was that Chernobyl was not a political crisis. It was a physical one. And physics does not participate in the performance. Within the first 48 hours, a small group of senior Soviet scientists and officials knew things that were simply impossible to square with the narrative being constructed. Valery Legasov was one of them. He was the deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute, the Soviet Union's premier nuclear research center. A man who had spent his career inside the system, who believed in what Soviet science could achieve, who was not by nature a dissident or a skeptic. He was appointed to the government commission and flew to Chernobyl on the night of April 26th. What he saw there destroyed something in him that never recovered. Legasov stood near the reactor building and looked at what the explosion had left. The core, blown open, was burning with an intense white-orange heat, visible even at distance. Thermal radiation pouring off the exposed graphite in waves that you could see and feel before you were close enough to understand what you were looking at. He understood immediately what this meant. The core was not intact. The explosion had not been contained within the building.
The reactor itself was destroyed, exposed, burning, and it would continue to burn, pumping radionuclides into the atmosphere for as long as the graphite inside the core kept feeding the reaction. He ran the numbers in his head and arrived at a figure that he later said felt like it belonged to a science fiction novel. The amount of radioactive material above the core, suspended in the smoke, the steam, the burning graphite, was staggering. Not in the way a difficult engineering problem is staggering, in the way that an open wound is staggering when you see the bone. He filed his reports. He used careful language, measured language, the kind of language that could travel up the chain without triggering the instinct at each level to soften it further. And still, by the time his assessments reached the appropriate political levels, they had been interpreted through the established framework. Serious industrial accident, situation being addressed, measures in place. Not, we have a burning reactor core in open contact with the atmosphere, and we have no procedure for this, because this was never supposed to be possible. The RBMK reactor, the design powering Chernobyl, had a known flaw. Not unknown to everyone, known to certain nuclear physicists who had done the theoretical work. But the information about this flaw had been classified, not published in the scientific literature, not distributed to the operators of the reactors, not incorporated into the training manuals. The men and women running the Chernobyl plant every night had been operating equipment with a potentially lethal design characteristic without ever being told it existed. Why was it classified? Not because of any specific conspiracy. Because the RBMK was a Soviet design, and admitting publicly that a Soviet reactor design had a serious safety flaw would be an admission that Soviet nuclear technology, the crown jewel of Soviet scientific achievement, the physical embodiment of the argument that socialist industry could outperform the West, was imperfect. You cannot publish that, so you don't. You file it. You route it through classified channels. You assume that the conditions under which the flaw becomes dangerous will never be allowed to develop. And then one night in April, they develop. The operators at Reactor 4, running a test they had never properly trained for, pushed the system into exactly the configuration that the classified reports said must never happen. They didn't know. Nobody had told them. Legasov knew all of this within the first days. He understood the full architecture of it, the design flaw, the classified suppression, the training gaps, the chain of softened reports. He was standing inside a disaster that was itself the product of the system that was now trying to manage it. What was the alternative? Go to Gorbachev and say, "Our entire nuclear program is built on a foundation that cannot tell the truth about its own vulnerabilities"? Say that the accident was not an aberration, but a logical consequence of how the system worked? He was not ready to say that. Not yet. So he did what the system required. He contributed his expertise to the immediate response. He helped design the approach to stopping the burning core. He participated in the official narrative. He was brilliant, and he was trapped, and he knew both things simultaneously. The immediate response to the burning reactor was, in its physical terms, almost incomprehensible. The core had to be smothered. The theory was that if enough material could be dropped onto the exposed reactor, the burning graphite could be deprived of oxygen, the reaction slowed, the release of radioactive material into the atmosphere reduced. The material of choice was a combination of sand, clay, lead, and boron. The only way to get it there, given that the radiation levels near the reactor were high enough to destroy the electronics of any ground-based equipment, high enough to kill an unprotected person within minutes of exposure, was from the air, by helicopter. Pilots were recruited. Some volunteered. Some were ordered. The distinction matters, but also, in practice, barely existed. In the Soviet military, the line between a request and an order was theoretical, and both men knew it. The pilots flew their helicopters directly over the open reactor core, hovering while ground crews loaded bags of sand and lead into cargo nets, then releasing them into the burning hole below. The bags, dropped from 100 feet, didn't always land where they were supposed to. The smoke and steam rising from the core made navigation nearly impossible. The instruments in the helicopters were giving wildly erratic readings as the radiation affected their electronics. The pilots kept flying. Each pass over the reactor delivered a radiation dose. The dosimeters the pilots carried, the official ones, the ones that would determine whether they had received enough radiation to be grounded, were the type that maxed out at a relatively low level. When a pilot's dosimeter read maximum, he had officially received his maximum allowable dose. The regulations said he should be removed from duty, but the regulations had been written for a world where a maximum allowable dose was an extreme edge case. In the skies above Reactor 4, in the first days of May 1986, the dosimeters were maxing out on the first or second pass. A supervisor on the ground, an Air Force general named Antoshkin, made a decision. He told the pilots that the dosimeter readings were not to be the limiting factor. The mission continued. The pilots flew dozens of passes each. They flew until the helicopters needed fuel. Then they refueled and flew again. Later accounts describe pilots vomiting between flights, skin flushing red, the metallic taste in the mouth that is one of the first signs that the body is absorbing more radiation than it was built to survive. They flew anyway. One pilot who flew repeated sorties in those first days developed severe hematological problems within months, his white blood cell counts collapsing in the specific pattern that radiation damage produces.
a pattern that the military medical system was, even then, already being instructed to attribute to other causes. Other crew members who flew over the reactor in those first 48 hours documented their deteriorating health for years afterward, filing claims and appeals through a system that had been structured at every level to not confirm what the dosimetry clearly showed. The liquidators, that's the Soviet term for all the people who were sent in to deal with the aftermath, and there were hundreds of thousands of them over the following years, lived inside this paradox in the most literal way. They were told they were heroes. They were given medals. They marched in the same May Day parades they'd always marched in, only now, some of them had radiation burns under their dress uniforms. They were told that the doses they had received were safe. Official medical records, in many cases, were altered. Dosimeters were shared, readings were averaged, documented doses were reduced on paper so that the men could continue working without triggering the regulatory limits that would have required their removal. The men knew their dosimeters were being managed. Some of them joked about it. What else do you do when the official fiction is so obvious that even the people maintaining it are aware of how thin it is?
A Belarusian nuclear physicist named Vasil Nesterenko tried from very early on to actually measure the radiation doses being received by the liquidators and the civilian populations in the contaminated zones. He drove from village to village with his own equipment. He knocked on doors. He held his instruments near children's throats to measure the accumulation in their thyroid glands. The readings he got were terrifying, far above what the official public health guidance acknowledged. He brought his data to the Belarusian government. He brought it to Moscow. He was told that his measurements were alarmist, that they were creating unnecessary panic, that they were politically unhelpful. He was removed from his position. He kept measuring anyway, privately, for years. His data would eventually contribute to the scientific understanding of the health consequences of Chernobyl, consequences that the official Soviet and later post-Soviet accounting consistently underestimated. He was not a hero in any official sense. He was just a man with a measuring instrument and a refusal to stop using it. That combination turned out to be more dangerous to the official story than any dissident. Back in Moscow, in the Kremlin offices where the shape of the Soviet state's response was being decided, Gorbachev was receiving briefings that were, even by Soviet standards, unusually direct. Partly because the situation was too large and too visible to soften beyond a certain point. Partly because the international pressure, the Swedes, the Germans, the Americans, the IAEA asking questions through diplomatic channels, was creating a kind of external accountability that the internal Soviet system had never had to contend with. When your accident is setting off alarms in Stockholm, there is only so much you can claim to not know. His public response remained cautious, measured, delayed.
Gorbachev did not address the Soviet people about Chernobyl until May 14th, 18 days after the explosion. 18 days. The most significant industrial disaster in human history, happening in his country, and the leader of that country waited 18 days to speak directly to his citizens about it. When he finally appeared on television, he was composed, authoritative, his face carrying the specific gravity of a man delivering serious news while very carefully controlling how serious that news was allowed to sound. He blamed the accident on the operators, on local negligence, on the human failure of specific individuals who had violated procedures. This was not entirely dishonest. Procedures had been violated. The operators had made decisions that contributed to the disaster, but it was radically incomplete. It said nothing about the reactor design flaw, nothing about the classified reports that had suppressed knowledge of that flaw, nothing about the institutional culture that had ensured the operators weren't trained for the scenarios they were trying to run. It located the accident in individual bodies rather than in the body of the system. But something had shifted in that speech, something that would not shift back. Gorbachev said something that Soviet leaders did not say. He said that information about the accident had not been delivered to the population quickly enough. He said, in careful, hedged language, but in language that was unmistakably present, that the absence of timely information had been a problem, that citizens had a right to know about threats to their safety, that the response to Chernobyl had revealed the need for what he called glasnost, openness, transparency, a new way of the state relating to information. He had been using this word before Chernobyl, but Chernobyl gave it weight it hadn't had, made it not just a reform program, but a response to something that had gone visibly, catastrophically wrong. And the moment Gorbachev said out loud on national television that the Soviet state had withheld information from its people and that this was a problem, he had stepped onto something he could not step off. Because if the state had withheld information about Chernobyl, what else had it withheld? If the official dosimetry records were manipulated, what else in the official record was managed? If the reactor design had a classified flaw that operators weren't told about, what other classified flaws lived in other systems, medical, industrial, military, that the population was relying on without knowing they were broken? The question didn't arrive all at once. It spread the way contamination spreads, carried by invisible currents, settling into the substrate, only showing its presence when someone finally takes a measurement. It arrived in the minds of people who had spent their entire lives performing the compliance that the system required, because the performance had always seemed like the rational choice. Chernobyl made the performance feel different. Not impossible yet, but different. Heavier. Legasov was still carrying everything he knew, still inside the system, still attending the meetings, still writing the reports in the careful language that could travel through the chain. In 1986, he was sent to Vienna to present the Soviet government's technical account of the accident to the International Atomic Energy Agency, a session that became, by all accounts, genuinely extraordinary. Standing before an audience of the world's nuclear scientists, Legasov delivered a presentation that was comprehensive, detailed, and more honest than anything the Soviet government had yet produced publicly. He described the reactor flaw. He described the procedural violations. He was precise and he was somber, and the scientists in that room recognized immediately that they were hearing something real. Some of the Soviet officials in the room were furious. He had said more than he was supposed to say. He had shown the seam. He returned to the Soviet Union and began the slow process of coming apart. Not publicly, not yet. Internally, the man who had spent his entire career believing that the system could be made to work, that expertise could function within the party framework, that the institutions he'd dedicated his life to were fundamentally sound, that man was losing the argument with himself. He wrote reports recommending changes to nuclear safety protocols. The reports were received, filed, set aside. He wrote them again. He gave speeches at conferences. He watched the recommendations sit. On April 27, 1988, 2 years and 1 day after the explosion at Reactor 4, Valery Legasov was found dead in his apartment. He had hanged himself. He left behind recorded tapes, audio recordings in which he laid out in plain language the things he had not said publicly. The design flaw, the suppression, the culture that made it all possible. The tapes were duplicated and passed around in scientific circles. They were not published officially. His death was announced in Pravda in 2 sentences. And what remains, what sits in the ground and in the air, and in the thyroid glands of children who were standing outside in Kyiv on May Day 1986, waving flags at a parade their government ordered forward because the show had to go on. The contaminated zone around the plant, the exclusion zone, 30 kilometers in every direction, is still there. The most contaminated areas will remain uninhabitable for longer than the Soviet Union existed,
longer than the United States has existed, longer than any political system currently alive in the world is likely to survive. The soil holds what the air released. The forests hold it. The river system carries it, slowly, in increments too small to see, but too consistent to ignore. Children in Belarus and Ukraine, adults now, middle-aged, some of them grandparents, received doses in those first days and weeks that shaped their medical histories for the rest of their lives. The KGB files are partially opened now. The classified reports on the reactor design flaws have been published. The dosimetry records that were altered, some of them have been reconstructed, matched against independent measurements, the gaps made visible. The lie is documented now, filed, archived, cross-referenced. Historians can walk through its architecture the way engineers walk through a collapsed building, identifying the point where the load was too great and the structure gave way. But the documentation lives in archives, and the contamination lives in the ground. Somewhere in the zone, in what used to be a village, in a yard where someone's grandmother planted tomatoes every spring for 40 years, and then one April was put on a bus and told she'd be back in 3 days. A lock sits open on a door. A calendar on the wall shows April 1986. A pair of children's shoes rests by the threshold, small and ordinary, in a silence that has lasted 4 decades. That image is not a metaphor. It is a photograph. You can find it. People have been finding it for 40 years, traveling into the zone with cameras, documenting the specific texture of a world that was abandoned mid-sentence. Every photograph of those shoes, that calendar, that locked door, each one is also a document of what happens when a system built on managed information meets a catastrophe that refuses to be managed. The reactor is still there. The sarcophagus that was built to contain it, hastily, desperately by liquidators who worked in short shifts because longer ones would have been fatal, began cracking within years of its construction.
A new containment structure was built over it, a massive steel arch completed in 2016, the largest movable land structure ever built by human hands, slid into place on rails to cover what the original sarcophagus could no longer hold. It is designed to last 100 years. After that, someone else will have to figure it out. What Gorbachev started with his May 14th speech, that careful, hedged acknowledgement that information had been withheld, didn't stay careful and hedged. The glasnost that Chernobyl charged with new urgency didn't stop at nuclear power. It went sideways into journalism, into literature, into the question of whether the history the Soviet state had been telling about itself, not just about Chernobyl, but about everything, going all the way back, going back to the collectivization, the purges, the pact with Hitler, the war, the Gulag, whether any of that history was trustworthy. Once that question was loose, once it was being asked in newspapers and kitchen conversations, and eventually in the new elected bodies that Gorbachev's reforms had created, it could not be recalled. You cannot unask a question that has already been answered badly once. The Soviet Union had spent 70 years building the architecture of that lie. Chernobyl didn't destroy it in a night, but it put a crack in the load-bearing wall. And in the years that followed, as the crack spread and the building groaned, the people living inside it, 300 million of them, were making a calculation they had never quite made before. The calculation that compliance required. Is the performance sustainable? Is the story still coherent enough to participate in? For 70 years, enough of them had said yes to keep the ceiling up. Chernobyl didn't change the answer immediately. It changed the weight of the question. And that weight, accumulating silently in the substrate of Soviet public life the way cesium accumulates in soil, was about to become something no system could carry. 300 million people woke up the morning after Chernobyl,
and went to work. They stood in bread lines and rode the metro and sent their children to school and did all the things that people do when the world is still officially intact. The system was still running. The trains were on time. The newspapers arrived. But something had shifted in the substrate. Not in the headlines, not in any place you could point to, but in the specific quality of the silence that surrounded the story that everyone knew was larger than what was being printed about it. Soviet citizens were extraordinarily skilled readers of silence. Decades of living inside a system where what wasn't said was as important as what was had made them fluent in that particular language. The silence around Chernobyl communicated in ways the official statements could not suppress. The questions that couldn't be asked publicly were being asked privately, in kitchens, in the specific lowered voice register that Russians and Ukrainians and Belarusians had developed for conversations that weren't supposed to be happening. Is it safe to drink the water? Should we be giving the children milk? My cousin in Kyiv says the dosimeters at work are reading high, but the supervisors told everyone to ignore it. What does that mean? And underneath all of those immediate, practical questions, a deeper one that nobody quite phrased aloud, but that hung in the air of every one of those conversations. How long have they known things and not told us? Not just about this, about everything. That question was the crack becoming a fissure. Gorbachev's glasnost policy had existed before Chernobyl as a relatively contained political program, a tool for modernizing the Soviet economy by reducing the bureaucratic friction that came from layers of officials all managing information rather than sharing it. He wanted a more efficient system. He wanted the truth to travel faster up the chain so that better decisions could be made at the top. He did not, as far as anyone can reconstruct his thinking from that period, intend to open a conversation about whether the system itself was the problem. That was not the plan. The plan was reform, not dissolution. Chernobyl did something to glasnost that Gorbachev hadn't anticipated. It gave it a face. It gave it a story that ordinary citizens could hold in their hands, a specific, undeniable instance of the state knowing something dangerous and choosing to manage that knowledge rather than share it. Once you have a concrete, documented example of the principle, once you can say, not in the abstract, but right now, pointing at a specific event, the policy of openness becomes something different. It becomes a demand. Not a gift from the leadership, but a right the people had earned by having been lied to about something that glows in the dark and gives children cancer. The Soviet press began, slowly and then faster and then all at once, to do something it had not done in living memory. Ask uncomfortable questions about events that were still happening. Not about history safely distant enough to criticize, the cult of personality stuff, the Stalin-era crimes that Khrushchev had already partially opened, but about now. About what was being done in the contaminated zones right now.
About why the official radiation maps didn't match what independent scientists were measuring. About the liquidators who were coming home sick and being told by the military medical system that their illnesses were unrelated to their service, that they had simply, coincidentally, developed health problems that bore no connection to the months they had spent shoveling radioactive debris with inadequate protective equipment. A journalist named Alla Yaroshinskaya began publishing in the late 1980s. She had obtained classified documents, minutes of the secret Politburo sessions on Chernobyl, the internal assessments that showed what the leadership actually knew and when. She published them in the Soviet Union, in a Soviet newspaper. The documents showed, in the dry, bureaucratic language of Politburo minutes, that officials at the highest levels had discussed the real scale of the contamination and made explicit decisions about what to tell the public. The gaps between the internal knowledge and the public statements were not the result of confusion or limited information. They were policy. The publication of those documents was its own kind of explosion. Slower, but in some ways more destructive, because it was not a physical event that could be contained or smothered. It was a fact. Printed, distributed, read. You cannot put a fact back inside a secret once enough people have seen it. The Soviet government threatened her. Calls came for her prosecution. And then, because this was 1990 and not 1970, because the architecture had already shifted enough that the usual tools of suppression were beginning to lose their certainty, nothing happened to her. She continued publishing. She was elected to the Soviet parliament. She stood in the chamber where Soviet power had always spoken from a single voice and said, in that chamber, what the documents showed. The system could not prosecute her without admitting what she had printed, and it could not admit what she had printed without admitting everything else. So it did nothing. And doing nothing in that moment was its own form of collapse. Understand what the Soviet Union was, structurally, at its most fundamental level. It was not primarily an economic system, or a military machine, or an ethnic federation, though it was all of those things. It was a legitimacy structure. Its claim to authority rested not on elections, or popular consent, or constitutional tradition, but on the argument that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union possessed a superior understanding of historical reality and was therefore uniquely qualified to lead. The party knew. The party's knowledge was the source of its power. Every Soviet institution, the media, the educational system, the medical establishment, the military, was organized around the central premise that the party's version of reality was the authoritative one. Chernobyl didn't just challenge that premise. It demonstrated, with the unambiguous physical evidence of contaminated soil and dying firefighters and radiation detectors going off in Sweden, that the party's version of reality had been catastrophically wrong. Wrong not in the small ways that any institution is wrong, but wrong in the specific, particular way that exposes the engine underneath. The party had said, "Our technology is superior." The reactor exploded. The party had said, "The situation is under control." The situation was not under control, and the evidence of this was visible from space. The party had said, "We protect our people." 50,000 people had been living 2 miles from a burning reactor core for 36 hours, while the party decided what to say. These are not abstract failures of policy. They are the specific kinds of failures that, once visible, cannot be unseen. The Soviet population saw them. In the late 1980s, as Glasnost expanded and the press began reporting what had previously been forbidden, the scope of what had been known and concealed became undeniable. Not just about Chernobyl, but about the economy, about the war in Afghanistan, about the true conditions in the gulags, about the famine years, about decades of falsified statistics that had painted a picture of Soviet prosperity that bore no relationship to the lives people were actually living. Chernobyl hadn't created any of those gaps. It had revealed that gaps existed. More critically, it had demonstrated that the system of managing information was not an aberration. It was the operating principle. The way the system worked in a nuclear disaster was the way it worked in everything. The thing that had always felt like it might be true, the thing that kitchen conversations had circled around for decades, was now a matter of printed record. In 1989, Soviet miners in Siberia went on strike. Not a small contained action. A massive work stoppage, tens of thousands of workers in the coal fields that powered Soviet industry. They had specific economic demands: better food, better safety equipment, better pay. But listen to what else they demanded. They demanded to know the truth about industrial accident rates. They demanded access to real safety data. They demanded an end to the practice of falsifying production figures that made their work look safer and more productive than it was. Coal miners demanding epistemological honesty from their government. That is not a normal labor dispute. That is what happens when a population has learned, from a disaster that still burns in memory, that the official version of reality is a managed fiction. Gorbachev met with their representatives. He made concessions. But the thing that had been broken couldn't be repaired with concessions, because it wasn't a dispute about wages. It was a dispute about the nature of the state's relationship with its own citizens. No reform path led back from that dispute to the coherent legitimacy structure that the Soviet Union required to function. You cannot rebuild the authority of an institution that claims superior knowledge when the population has concluded, from direct evidence, that the institution doesn't know or doesn't tell. By 1991, 5 years after the explosion at Reactor 4, the Soviet Union was gone. Not primarily because of Chernobyl. That would be too simple, and history resists simplicity. The economic stagnation was real. The Afghan war had bled the military and the public's confidence simultaneously. The various national and ethnic movements pushing for independence within the republics had their own deep roots that preceded Chernobyl by generations. But ask the people who lived through it. Ask the intellectuals who led the independence movements, the journalists who pushed the limits of glasnost, the politicians who broke with the party. A remarkable number of them, when asked to identify the moment they understood that the system was not fixable, point to Chernobyl. Not as a cause, but as a revelation. The moment the curtain fell, just far enough to see the mechanism behind it. Gorbachev himself, years later, said something that has been quoted often enough to risk becoming background noise, but deserves to be heard at full weight. Chernobyl, more than anything else, was perhaps the real cause of the Soviet Union's collapse. Not the economic pressures, not even the reforms he himself had initiated. The moment when the gap between what the state claimed and what was physically, irrefutably happening became too large for the architecture of compliance to bridge. That was what the accumulated weight of unanswered questions meant. That was what it broke. That was what it revealed. But while the geopolitical analysis was being written, while historians were drawing lines from the reactor to the parliament buildings where the flags came down, men were living in apartment blocks in Kyiv and Minsk and Moscow, whose bodies were writing a different kind of history. A history that didn't make it into the political science journals. A history measured in blood cell counts and pulmonary function tests, and the specific gravity of silences in doctors' offices, where the physician is trying to find the words for what needs to be said. The liquidators. 600,000 of them in the official count. The real number is almost certainly higher. They came in waves, from 1986 through 1990, from every corner of the Soviet Union. Soldiers, miners, construction workers, engineers, firefighters, helicopter pilots, medical personnel, scientists, workers conscripted from factories and told they were fulfilling their patriotic duty. They came to the zone around Chernobyl to do the work that had to be done, to remove contaminated topsoil, to build the sarcophagus over the reactor, to wash down the streets of the ghost towns, to kill the animals that had been left behind in the evacuation, the dogs and cats and livestock that couldn't be decontaminated, but couldn't be allowed to spread contamination by wandering outside the zone, to demolish buildings, to bury villages, literally bury them. The most contaminated settlements were pushed into trenches by bulldozers and covered with soil. Houses and trees, and whatever remained of the life that had been lived there, all of it compressed into the earth. Many of them were not told the full reality of what they were there for. They were told the acceptable version. There had been an accident. They were there to help with the cleanup,
Protective equipment would be provided. Dosimetry would be monitored. Everything was under control. Some received respirators. Some were given paper masks that filtered almost nothing. Some received lead aprons that protected their torsos but left their hands and faces and reproductive organs exposed. Some received fully adequate equipment but weren't told how to use it properly, or were told to remove it when supervisors came through because it looked bad.
Looked like the situation was more dangerous than the official assessment acknowledged. The dosimetry problem, already established at the level of the helicopter pilots, ran through every layer of the liquidator workforce. Men who had received doses that should have removed them from the work were recorded as having received lower doses so they could continue. The reasons were practical and callous, and made a certain brutal sense within the logic of the system. There was work to be done. There were not unlimited bodies available to do it. And if the actual doses were officially acknowledged, the workforce would collapse. So the workforce was protected from the knowledge of what it was absorbing, and the records were maintained at levels that allowed the work to continue. Among the hundreds of thousands who came through the zone, there were men like a construction worker from the Ural region, one of thousands who fit exactly this pattern, drafted to work on the sarcophagus in the autumn of 1986. He worked for 90 days. He wore a respirator when the supervisors weren't watching, and removed it when they were, because the supervisors had told him that visibly masked workers made for bad optics in the documentary footage that Soviet television was filming to demonstrate the controlled, professional nature of the cleanup. Men like him went home in December 1986. Within 2 years, many had developed what their local clinics described as vegetative dystonia, a Soviet medical catch-all diagnosis applied to liquidators with remarkable frequency, conveniently non-specific enough to avoid establishing any causal link between a patient's service and his symptoms. Applications for liquidator status, which would have entitled them to enhanced medical care and modest disability pensions, were denied again and again. The dosimetry records showed allowable doses had been received. They had not. This pattern was not exceptional.
It was close to universal among the liquidators who came home sick. What remained consistent across hundreds of documented cases that researchers and advocacy organizations have compiled over decades, was the gap between what the men's bodies showed and what the official records said. The men knew the dosimetry was managed. Some of them joked about it, the specific dark humor of people who understand exactly what is being done to them and have no mechanism to stop it. What else do you do when the official fiction is so obvious that even the people maintaining it are aware of how thin it is? The survivors who spoke to researchers in the years after Soviet secrecy gave way to partial openness described a specific quality of resigned duty, not blind obedience, not naive patriotism, but something more complicated and more human. Men who understood, at some level, what the zone was costing them, who could read radiation gauges and do basic math and feel the gap between their official doses and their actual exposure, who kept working anyway because the work was real, the necessity was real, and the alternative was that someone else would have to stand in the same place. That is not the story of victims. It is something more difficult than victimhood. It is the story of people operating inside a system that had structured the choices so that the only options were complicity or dereliction, and who chose the option that felt, given everything they had been taught about duty and collective survival, like the more honorable one, and then came home and spent decades fighting that same system for the medical care it owed them. One of the liquidators' physicians who worked at a Kyiv clinic throughout the 1990s described the pattern this way in a recorded interview. They came in already apologizing for being there, already explaining that they knew the official records showed their doses were within limits, already preparing for the conversation where we would tell them what the records said rather than what their bodies said.
They had been trained, over years of denials, to preemptively concede the argument against their own suffering. That is the final and most durable form of the lie. Not the Politburo minutes, not the 18-second Vremya announcement, not even the falsified dosimetry logs. The most durable form is the one that lives inside the person who was harmed. The internalized expectation that the official account will prevail over their own experience, that their body's evidence is less credible than a managed number on a state document. Some of those men carried that expectation to their graves. Some are still carrying it. The zone itself, the exclusion zone, the 30-kilometer radius around the plant, has become, in the decades since the evacuation, something nobody planned for and nobody quite knows how to categorize. It is simultaneously a crime scene, an ecosystem, a memorial, a scientific laboratory, a tourist destination, and a kind of accidental monument to a specific moment in history when the physical world and the political world collided so violently that neither emerged intact. The forests closest to the reactor, the stand of pine trees that absorbed such a massive dose of radiation in the first days that they turned brown and red before dying, which is why they're called the Red Forest, are still there. The trees are dead. They haven't rotted in the conventional sense, because the microorganisms and fungi that would normally break down dead organic matter were themselves killed by the radiation and have been slow to recover. The Red Forest is, in places, a standing archive of death. Trees that died in 1986, still upright, preserved by the same contamination that killed them. It is one of the stranger and more quietly horrifying landscapes on Earth. Go further from the reactor, into the outer reaches of the zone, and something else is happening that scientists are still working to understand. Wildlife has returned. Not in spite of the contamination, but in some meaningful ecological sense, because of it. Because the removal of human habitation has been, for large mammals, worth more than the radiation. Wolves, lynx, wild boar, European bison, brown bears, Przewalski's horses, all have established populations in the zone. The radiation affects them at the cellular level. Studies document elevated rates of mutation, cataracts, reduced fertility in some populations. The animals closest to the reactor have measurably shorter lifespans than those further from it. But the populations persist, and in some cases thrive, because the alternative to a contaminated forest with no humans is an uncontaminated forest with humans. And for large predators, human absence outweighs almost everything else. The zone has become, despite everything, a refuge. That fact is not reassuring. It's haunting. Because what it tells you is not that the radiation wasn't severe. It was, and is. What it tells you is that what human civilization does to wild spaces is worse than what a nuclear disaster does to them. At least for species that have the option to survive at all. That is a data point that asks to be sat with quietly, without being rushed toward a conclusion. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant continued operating after the disaster. Unit 4, the one that exploded, was sealed in the sarcophagus. Units 1, 2, and 3 kept generating electricity for years. Unit 3, the last to shut down, ran until the year 2000. 14 years after the explosion, workers were still clocking in and out of the plant that had caused the largest nuclear disaster in history, walking past the sarcophagus on their way to the functioning reactors, doing the shift work of nuclear power generation in the shadow of the concrete box that contained what couldn't be contained. This fact appears in almost no popular account of Chernobyl. It doesn't fit the narrative of catastrophe and abandonment. It's too strange for that narrative. But it happened. Today, the exclusion zone is a destination. People pay for guided tours. They photograph the abandoned city of Pripyat, the amusement park that opened for exactly 1 day before the evacuation. the bumper cars still sitting where they were left, the Ferris wheel that never ran. They photograph the schools, the kindergartens where children's gas masks have been arranged by previous visitors into compositions designed to be maximally disturbing. A whole genre of Chernobyl photography exists that is beautiful in ways that should make you uncomfortable, because beauty was not the point of what happened here. And aestheticizing it requires a specific detachment from the people whose lives were in those buildings.
The tourism isn't trivial either. Hundreds of thousands of people a year, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine disrupted the access routes, chose to stand in a place where history is not metaphor, but physical reality, where the consequences of decisions made by specific people on specific nights are still present in the soil and the air, still measurable by instruments, still being carried in the bodies of people who were children in April 1986 and are now in their 40s and 50s, and living with medical histories that official records still, persistently, minimize. The new containment structure, the new safe confinement, that massive steel arch completed in 2016, is designed to last 100 years. It is the most expensive nuclear safety project in history, funded largely by international donors, European governments, the United States, contributions from dozens of countries that had no obligation to pay for a disaster they didn't cause. They paid anyway. Because the reactor is not going to stop being a reactor because the Soviet Union dissolved. The physics does not recognize political change. The contamination in the soil of Belarus, which received the heaviest fallout of any country, heavier than Ukraine, heavier than Russia. That contamination remains Belarus's reality, whether Minsk wants to acknowledge its full scale or not. Some things exist entirely outside the jurisdiction of political decisions. The 100-year containment raises a question nobody has fully answered. What happens after those 100 years? The radioactive material inside Reactor 4, the corium, the lava-like mixture of melted reactor fuel and sand and concrete that flowed through the basement of the building in the days after the explosion and solidified into formations that physicists still study. That material will be actively dangerous for far longer than any structure built to hold it. Some components of it will remain hazardous for longer than any human institution has ever survived. We're building containers for something that will outlast not just the containers, but every form of governance and record-keeping and cultural memory that we currently possess. A field of study, only a few decades old, wrestles with this problem. The problem of nuclear semiotics. How do you warn future generations, people who may not share our languages or our cultural assumptions or even our cognitive frameworks, about the presence of something deadly underground? The markers we build to say __, quote _1__ are meaningful to us, built from our symbolic systems. In 10,000 years, those symbols may be as legible as linear A is to us today. Present, physical, and completely opaque. Researchers have proposed solutions ranging from the practical, enormous thorned concrete structures that communicate hostility through universal animal intuition, to the philosophical. Proposed institutions whose sole function would be the transmission across generations of the knowledge that certain places must never be entered. Chernobyl is not a temporary problem that has been given a permanent solution. It is a permanent problem that has so far been managed for 40 years with solutions that are themselves temporary. The sarcophagus was temporary. The new safe confinement is temporary. The monitoring programs depend on institutional continuity and political will that cannot be guaranteed across the timescale of the actual hazard. Every answer we have found is borrowed time. The reactor doesn't care about the timeline we're comfortable with. And then
there are the people. Somewhere in Kyiv tonight, a woman is going to sleep in an apartment she has lived in for 20 years. She is in her mid-40s. She teaches elementary school. She had a thyroid removed a decade ago. Cancer, caught early enough, in remission since, in the language of the oncology reports, that she keeps in the same drawer where she keeps her other documents. She was 6 years old on the morning of April 26, 1986. She was living in Pripyat. She played outside that Saturday before the buses came. She doesn't remember feeling anything unusual. She remembers it was warm. She remembers a friend's birthday party being canceled because suddenly adults were everywhere and a strange tension filled the air that she didn't have words for at 6. She got on one of the buses with her mother and her little brother.
She didn't bring anything she particularly cared about. You don't know, at 6, what to bring when you're leaving your life. She went back once, in 2019, as a tourist. She found her building. She found what had been her apartment. The lights were not on. The windows were gone, frames and all. The building was open to the weather. Inside, her childhood was a ruin that had been slowly consuming itself for 33 years. She stood in what had been her room and took a photograph. Not for social media. Just to have. Because something about standing in the physical space where a life had been interrupted mid-sentence required documentation, the way a wound requires being looked at directly before it can be treated. The photograph shows a room, peeling paint, a collapsed ceiling, daylight coming through where the window used to be. On the floor, half covered in plaster dust, a children's book. Still there after 33 years. Whether it's her book or someone else's, she doesn't know. It doesn't matter. The plaster dust has settled on it so gradually and so thoroughly that it looks like it has always been that way. Like the book was never meant to be read, was always meant to be found like this, in a room where the ceiling fell and the window disappeared. And everything became evidence of something that happened before the evidence itself could understand it. The half-life of cesium-137, one of the primary contaminants released at Chernobyl, is about 30 years. Which means that the ground around the plant has, in 40 years, lost roughly half its cesium contamination to radioactive decay. That sounds like progress. The other half is still there. It will take another 30 years to lose half of that remaining amount. The iodine, the strontium, the plutonium isotopes, those run on different clocks, some much longer, ticking on their own schedules, indifferent to human urgency or political change or the publication of declassified documents that finally say what happened. 40 years. The children who played outside that Saturday morning in Pripyat are approaching 50. The liquidators who were young men in 1986 are old now, the ones who survived. The Soviet Union has been gone for longer than it had left to live when the reactor blew. Gorbachev is dead. Legasov is long dead. The Politburo members who approved the May Day parade while Kyiv's radiation levels were 500 times above normal, they're gone. The reactor is still there. The woman who was 6 years old and got on the bus, she carries a specific image with her, the way the soil carries what was released that night. Quietly, continuously, without anyone outside being able to measure it precisely. She has described it in interviews with researchers who study the long-term experience of Chernobyl survivors. The moment she looked back through the rear window of the bus and saw her apartment building getting smaller, the windows still lit because her mother had left the lights on a Saturday afternoon, because they were coming back in 3 days. The lights were still on. The building kept getting smaller. And then the bus turned a corner. That was 40 years ago. Some things don't have a half-life. Some things don't decay.
The physics of memory operates on different principles than the physics of radioactive isotopes, and in some ways it is less forgiving. It does not reduce by half with the passage of years. It just sits there, in the dark, still warm. She looked back. The lights were on, and then they were gone.